I did my undergraduate education in business and psychology at the University of Exeter in the UK. And now I'm currently studying masters. I'm studying journalism at the University of Melbourne in Australia. How you can score very, very high. Giving yourself a lot of practice and hearing a lot of tests. That 1 minute is really important because during that 1 minute you can read all the questions.
Percentage of job, but if the percentage is higher, it doesn't mean that there are more job places. It's just the percentage is higher.
Incorrectly analyze the data.
Bugungi event juda ham mazmunli va foydali bo'ldi. Men shu paytgacha Cambridge o'quv markazida o'qigan bo'lsam, hali IELTS'dan 9 olgan insonni eshitmagan edim va biz shu paytgacha o'qigan bilimlarimizni endi yanada kuchaytirib va kuchliroq tayyorlanish uchun asosiy motivatsiyani oldik.
Cambridge! Assalomu alaykum hammaga. Sizlarni ko'rib turganimdan juda xursandman. Demak, bugungi tadbirimizga biz Ms.Aaniani chaqirganmiz, o'qituvchimizni. Va ular hozirda bizda ishlaydilar va IELTS'dan 9 olganlar, overall. Demak, tadbirimiz ingliz tilida bo'lib o'tadi. Hozir kirish qismi bo'lgancha o'zbek tilida tanishtiryapman. Okay, so let me switch on to English. So today we're going to have the speaker, Ms.Aania. She's our teacher at Cambridge. She got overall band 9 in IELTS. And let's introduce her. Clap. Ms.Aania. Thank you. So she will give first basic information about herself. And she will continue with the IELTS preparation, her experience, the mistakes that students often make. So, Ms.Aania.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is. It's really nice for everyone to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to start off by introducing myself. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm currently a master's student. I did my undergraduate education in business and psychology at the University of Exeter in the UK. And now I'm currently studying masters. I'm studying journalism at the University of Melbourne in Australia. So just to give you a little bit of background about my experience, I did my IELTS exam about 2 months ago. About 8 days to prepare. So it was very important for me to understand what the IELTS exam was requiring for me to do. Just to give you sort of a summary, I got a 9 in listening, an 8.5 in reading, 8.5 in writing, and a 9 in speaking. So I'm sure all of you know, but just in case you don't know, the IELTS exam is broken up into 4 sections. The 4 sections that I mentioned above, and they all have different tests that you have to complete, and then you get an average that gives you your overall mark. The first thing that I did was I got familiar with the rubric, and this is very, very important because you can be extremely smart, you can be extremely eloquent and fluent, but it's important that you understand what is the IELTS exam asking you to do. So the first thing that I did, and this is the public version, all the band descriptors are public. You can Google them on the IELTS website, the British Council website. And there are 3 rubrics. Basically, there's a rubric for writing task 1, writing task 2, and speaking. That's because, well, can anybody guess why there aren't rubrics for the other 2 tests? That's because it's marked out of 40, and your answer is either right or it's wrong. There's no subjectivity. The examiner cannot say, are they an 8, are they a 9, are they a 5, are they a 6? There's no question about it. It's either right or it's wrong. So the only band descriptors that you need to understand are, this is just an example, writing task 1, writing task 2, and speaking. So the first thing I would recommend you do is you become very familiar with the difference between all the marks, and I'll go into this later, but the importance of reading examples of different band marks. So. Oh, could you go back, please? One more. So let me start off with what I found to be the easiest part of the IELTS and then move up to what I found the most difficult and how I prepared for every single exam. So, as I mentioned, I only had about 8 days to prepare, so it was very important that I practiced every single day. And I know lots of people will say, well, English is your first language, why would you need to practice so much? And that's because there are a lot of strategies that you need to experiment with to find out what's going to be the best one for you. So to start off, I did listening. Now, who finds listening to be difficult, or do you find it to be easy? What are people's thoughts? Yeah? You think it's hard or it's easy? You think it's hard? Yeah, so everyone has different strengths and weaknesses in IELTS, but I agree with you. I think that listening was the easiest for me, and that's because there's very little strategy in terms of how you can score very, very high. It's just a matter of giving yourself a lot of practice and hearing a lot of tests so that you can figure out kind of what is the formula that the listening exam goes in. I'll tell you my personal strategy. I went on lots of blogs, and this is the one that I found most helpful. They say, you get 1 minute to read before you listen to the audio. That 1 minute is really important because during that 1 minute, you can read all the questions and try to guess what is the answer going to be. Is the answer going to be a name? Is it going to be the name of a country? Is it going to be the name of a person? Is it going to be a number? By reading all of those things and kind of guessing, I think I know what the answer is going to be, it means that you're a little bit more tuned in when you actually hear the answer. Does that make sense? So you're using that time productively. You're not just reading the questions and saying, okay, I'm waiting for the audio to start. No, you're using that time actively to say, what am I predicting the answers are going to be? So there's a lot of different strategies when it comes to listening, but this is the one that personally helped me. To give you a reference, I practiced about 2 listening tests a day. So by the end of it, I had done about 15 listening tests. The second thing that I found most difficult was reading. Is reading difficult for anybody? Yeah, reading's hard for you. Why is reading hard for you? Yeah. So what's hard for you is understanding the reading? Yeah. Is that the common for everybody else as well? No? Yes, absolutely. That is a really good point. And that's because they give you a lot to read, right? You have 3 texts. Typically, every text is about 800 to 1,000 words. And the way it is that the first text is the easiest, and then it becomes a little bit harder, and then it becomes a little bit harder. So ideally, the way that you need to plan yourself is give yourself the most time for the last text and the least time for the first text, in a perfect world. But I agree with you, it's a lot to read. I just want to be very honest and say that I probably had a different experience because English is like a second, third, fourth language for Uzbek students. So I can understand it's really hard to read complex text quickly. For me, the problem was not reading, it was, as you said, understanding, right? Understanding is really hard because a lot of the answers sound very similar. You wonder, is it A, is it B, which one is the right one? So a technique, once again, I looked at all the different strategies and I did many tests and I tried to see what strategy is working for me. So just to give you an example, one is they say, don't read the text, only read the answers. Only read the questions. After you read the questions and you see what are they asking, go back and look for keywords. If it's asking about the size of something, okay, you go back, you skim it. You say, okay, where are they talking about sizes? And let me just read 2-3 lines. So that's something that can help. Personally, for me, I did a variation of that. So I read everything, then I read it quickly, not every single word. I read everything, then I looked at the questions, and then I said, okay, let me go back and read this. So this is kind of anecdotal, this is my personal experience. I don't know if anybody can relate to this, but in exams I get nervous. And when you're nervous, you wonder, I wrote this answer, maybe it's this answer, maybe it's something else, right? Everyone's nodding their head. Yeah, so exam anxiety can make you doubt yourself. When I was actually doing my reading prep, I was getting a lot of questions wrong. And I was wondering, why am I getting these questions wrong? And that's because when I was doing the test, I was writing an answer, then I was changing it, and then I would go to my answer and it was right the first time, right? So I was overthinking. And the advice that my brother gave me the day before my exam was, trust yourself. Trust the answer that you wrote the first time because you understood it. if you overthink, if you read too much into it, you're likely to try to analyze it in a way that IELTS is not asking you to analyze it, right? So everyone's nodding. I think everyone kind of makes this mistake, is that they doubt themselves and they change their answer, and then you wonder, why did I change my answer? I was right the first time. So I did, once again, about 1 or 2 reading tasks a day. The second most difficult for me was speaking. And I'm sure you're wondering, for speaking, who finds it the most difficult? Anybody? Yeah, for you? Yes? Why do you find speaking to be difficult? Or which part do you think is the most difficult? Part 1, part 2, part 3? Part 3? Okay. Okay, so, yeah, exactly. Does anybody find part 2 to be the hardest? Yeah? Okay. Personally, for me, part 2 was the hardest. And that's because part 2 requires kind of a formula. It requires you to really use your time efficiently. What made me the most nervous was having 1 minute to prepare and then 2 minutes to talk, and you don't know how much time has passed. Have I been writing notes for 10 seconds? Have I been writing notes for 50 seconds? When you're talking to the examiner, you don't know, do I have 10 seconds left? Do I have 1 minute left? So it's very, personally for me, it was very disorienting. The way I practiced speaking was I must have done every prompt on the internet. Every single website I went and I did every single question that I could. And as you mentioned, or everybody who said part 3 is the hardest, part 3 requires a general awareness of the world. It's not just about personal experience. And so I would recommend for part 3 to read lots of different articles, everything that's going on in the world, so that you're able to answer kind of the global questions and analyze it. But for part 2, which I found to be the most difficult, I thought, okay, I have to train myself to understand how to use my time correctly. And so by doing that, I would go on a prompt, I would put my timer on 1 minute, I would look at the prompt, answer the questions. When my timer went off, then I would talk for 2 minutes. And when I was preparing, I had my timer, I would answer the questions, and then I would look, I'd say, okay, I have 30 seconds left, I need to remember how to form it. Eventually, so for the first day, I made a lot of mistakes. I would talk too much, or I would talk too little, and I wasn't understanding, how to pace myself, right? How to give myself a rhythm so that I'm talking like a conversation with the IELTS examiner, but still answering all the questions and not going in a different direction. So the first 1 or 2 days, I wasn't doing a very good job. After the 3rd or 4th day, I was timing myself, and automatically my body knew, okay, 1 minute is finishing now. Okay, I've reached the second point, I have about 45 more seconds to talk. So this is something I would recommend because your body gets into a habit, right? The more you practice, the more your body will understand kind of how time is passing. And so has it ever happened to anybody during practice that you, after 1 minute or 20 seconds, you don't have anything more to say? Has it ever happened? Yeah. And I can understand that. It happened to me as well. The only thing I can recommend, and I'll talk about this later in later parts of my presentation, is you need to, I sound like a broken record, it's about practice. It's really about dedicated, focused practice and making sure that it's not just like, okay, I'm gonna try to talk and see if I can answer all the questions. Try to give yourself exam conditions and say, okay, if this is 2 minutes and you're looking at the time, you're saying, I have 45 seconds, how can I think of more to talk about while I have this time? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. And then writing, that was my most difficult. Who thinks writing is the hardest part of IELTS? Yes. Yes, exactly. Which one's harder for you, task 1 or task 2? Really? Okay, for me, task 1. Task 1 is the hardest. So task 1 for me is the hardest because it requires a very different skill of writing, right? Report writing. So as I mentioned, I'm a journalism student, so we write news articles. In school, I wrote academic articles. In my childhood, I wrote creative writing stories. But writing task 1 requires a strong overview and good reporting of data. Can everyone agree with that? Yeah. And what is the hardest part? It's the overview, right? Making sure that you have a solid overview and making sure that you're concisely summarizing all the data, personally for me, was the hardest part. I'm going to briefly mention task 2 because I wasn't expecting people to think that that was the most difficult part. But can anyone tell me why they think writing task 2 is hard? Giving an opinion? Giving an opinion in writing. Does anybody else have any thoughts? Yeah. So, making a plan. Okay, when you say generating an opinion, is it because you don't have an opinion or you're not sure kind of how to put it in the essay? Yeah, and you don't think you have enough time for that? Yeah, I can see that. You know, that comes with a lot of understanding paragraph structures. And honestly, IELTS is not really asking you for what you really think. It's just asking for your opinion. Exactly. So if you think, okay, my opinion is a little complicated, but this other opinion is easier, just write from that perspective, you know? The examiner doesn't know what your opinion is. You just have to choose what is the strongest point that I can make, you know? And if the strongest point, let's say the question is like phones should be banned. Do you think phones should be banned? No. But maybe if you think that the argument is stronger that yes, phones should be banned, just use that one. You know what I mean? As you mentioned, you know, critical analysis, absolutely it's right. But I think a lot of times students get very personal with their essays, and you don't have to be personal, you have to be logical. How can I make the strongest argument for this question? It doesn't have to be true, right? So moving on to task 1, the reason that task 1 personally was so hard for me was because I found it really hard to write a succinct overview, right? How can you analyze all this data in 2 lines? And then after that, how can you talk about 10 pieces of data in 150 words? That was the hardest for me. And there were a lot of things that I did, but one of the things that I did was in my overview, as a general rule, I tried to talk about the highest and the lowest. That was typically my rule. Obviously, it depends from example to example, but that was my typical rule. And when I was analyzing data, and I'll show you examples later, I would take 2 minutes in the beginning. I would look at all the data and I would write it down. Like not in sentences, just like years, countries, numbers, number. And then when I was writing my essay, I would say, okay, I wrote this down, cross it out, wrote this down, cross it out. So if I had 12 pieces of data and I covered 8 of them, I'd say, okay, I've covered the most important ones. So does anybody use that technique? Does anybody write down the data before they start writing it? No? Yeah? Some people yes, some people no. For those people who do it, do you find it to be helpful? Yeah? And I would recommend for people who don't do it, try it. You know, there are a lot of strategies, and this is personally what worked for me. So I would recommend that people give it a shot. This is going to kind of conclude my general IELTS experience. Just for reference, both of my exams were online. Reading, writing, listening, I did online, and then my speaking exam was also online. So if anyone did paper-based ones, maybe your experience will be a little bit different. So can you skip, please? We're going to do a little Kahoot, but before that, this Kahoot basically is very general. It's not difficult. It's just asking about the structure of the IELTS exam so that you know, I think the most important thing is that you know when you're going into the exam, kind of what is the structure. Don't ever be shocked when you're going into the exam and you're like, oh, I didn't expect for this to happen. So before the Kahoot, I want to ask if there's any questions regarding my personal experience before we move on to the second part of this presentation. Yeah, go ahead. One time. You know, I would say that once you understand the strategies, it becomes easier. For me, my command over English was not the problem. It was more if I could tailor it to fit what IELTS was asking me to do. you know? So in that case, I was very nervous before my IELTS exam because I think everyone is nervous before exams. No, you're not nervous? Wow, I wish I had your confidence. I was very nervous. My student visa. Yeah, for Australia, I need to do my IELTS exam. Academic. You know, I can't speak for paper-based because I didn't do the exam. I only did computer-based. But for me personally, it was very seamless. I was nervous that during my speaking exam, maybe the examiner wouldn't be able to hear me or something like that, but it wasn't the case for me.
Where did you take the IELTS? In Uzbekistan or India?
Uzbekistan. I live here, so I did the exam here.
PC, right? Or IDP?
British Council. I can't speak for IDP. I've never done the exam there. Are there any more questions? Yeah?
How can I practice my speaking skills?
How can you improve your speaking skills?
Yeah.
Well, it just comes with speaking, honestly. It comes with having a lot of topics, especially, you know, if you want to be productive, practicing IELTS topics. And if you can, talk with someone who's fluent or someone who's comfortable speaking English so that they're able to correct you. And honestly, it comes with just having a lot of practice. So whether you practice by yourself, you know, just talking to yourself, talking with a friend, practicing in a class, I would say that's the best way to improve your speaking skills. There was some other questions? Yeah?
Does movies help for us, like speaking or listening skills?
Yes, I absolutely think it helps with listening skills. And I would recommend if you can watch videos that have subtitles in it, because sometimes listening, you don't understand every word, but if you read it and listen at the same time, you're kind of using multiple senses, and that might help cement your understanding. So yeah, and something I always recommend is watching kids shows. Like cartoons or something, because typically they talk a little bit slower than in movies, and that speed might be more comfortable when you're starting off, and then you can work up to movies or TV shows or something like that. No problem. You have to.
Okay. Is it good to write one argument for each body paragraph in writing task 2, or having a lot of arguments and not a good one? I saw from one video that if you write one argument for each body paragraph, it's better to support so that the examiner will understand that you have a good knowledge of writing task 2.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times you can take a lot of perspectives, but it's important to know that your minimum is 250 words. So you should write maybe 350 words. If you write too many, you're not being critical. So you might mention this is advantage, disadvantage, disadvantage, and not really explain, not give any examples, and that way you're not showing that you kind of understand holistically, you know? So definitely, I would say to take one or two strong points and then expand on that.
How did you work on your cohesive devices? I mean, linking. We can generate ideas and make sentences, but they are not quite, say,
Cohesive?
yeah, cohesive
Yeah.
and understandable. They understand, but not in that level which maybe 8.5 or 9 band
Yeah.
scores have. What did you do to improve your cohesive? We can improve our vocabulary by adding some strong words or grammar, which we can complex sentence, but cohesive devices, they're the ones which are looking of students.
Yeah, I think with cohesive devices, sometimes students, when they try to make their work cohesive, they add too many cohesive devices. And what that ends up doing is it makes your text not cohesive at all. If you're saying furthermore, in addition, and on the other side, you know, everything, you're basically breaking it up. I would say, obviously it's hard to say, but in a paragraph, try to include maybe one or two. Don't include so many that it basically distracts from what you're trying to say. It will come naturally the more you read, the more you write. It will come naturally when you're trying to think of a transition between two sentences. But in your experience, do you try to overcompensate by adding a lot of cohesive devices?
If it's appropriate, I would just use it. But how did you know that you would get a high score from writing? Did you have such kind of expectation?
No.
Writing? No?
No.
8.5?
No, not at all.
What was it like emotions when you got that 8.5 from writing? How did you feel that?
I guess I was happy. I mean, you know, when I started, I didn't know anybody who had done IELTS before. You know, I knew like 1 or 2 people. I didn't know that writing was such a struggle for students. It was only after I got my score and when I started applying for jobs and stuff, and I started talking to students, that I realized that writing is kind of the glass ceiling that students hit. They get maybe really great marks in all the other tests, but then writing is kind of the struggle for them. I didn't realize until just recently.
Just like watch some, like saw the results of the other previous speaking exams, right? For example, there is such kind of channel called Recent IELTS, and students just post their previous IELTS exams.
What's the channel?
Like recent IELTS exams.
Recent
Which
IELTS? Is it a
exam?
YouTube video?
No, it's channel. Telegram
Oh, on
channel.
Telegram?
Yeah, and students who got who were in the speaking exam, they just write what kind of question was there, so that the next people who want to take IELTS exam speaking, they can
Practice it?
Yeah, practice it. Did you do such kind of thing?
No, I didn't even know that this channel existed. All I did was, as I said, I went on the internet. I pretty much answered maybe 70–80% of everything on Google. I answered everything. And when you sign up with the British Council, they give you like 2 free resources, like practice ones, I think. Yeah. So that's what I practiced. Oh,
Sure.
and another thing is I watched a lot of YouTube videos and where there would be a speaker and then there would be an examiner or a teacher, and he would pause the video and say, she did this, what was her mistake, what she did good. And I watched 9, I watched 8.5, I watched 8, I watched 7.5. I tried to watch everything above 7 to see what is the difference that students are making, to kind of see like, okay, if I want a 9, how can I replicate what she did or what he did?
And it's speaking in part 2, some students just write some tips on what kind of collocations or what kind of words they will speak. Speaking part 2. But sometimes they forget, how do you do it unconsciously? What's the strategy for doing that? For example, you write some collocations and you are talking, but after the speaking exam, you remember that you forgot using them.
In part 2?
Yeah.
Well, you know, you're talking about speaking part 2, right? So that's a good point. For me, when there were keywords that I wanted to use that I thought were going to show my proficiency, I wrote them down in the 1 minute that I had. So I wrote down the notes to answer all the bullet points, and then on the side, I wrote down a few words. I don't remember what I wrote, which words I wrote, but I said I want to use 2 or 3 words. And then when I was talking for 2 minutes, I wrote down so I didn't forget that I wanted to use these keywords. So I would recommend you do something like that. In the 1 minute that you have, if you think, okay, these are going to impress the IELTS examiner that I know these words, write them down.
Did you use some collocations or idioms or some fixed expressions? Things?
I'm sure I did say collocations. I don't think I used any idioms. Personally, I don't think I used them. But collocations, you know, when you speak English kind of fluently, you don't really notice when you're using a collocation or an idiom. Okay, I guess you notice idioms, but collocations you don't notice so much. So I'm sure I used some that were relevant, but I can't give you an example because I wasn't really realizing it at the time. You had a question? Oh, just my favorite book to read. Have you heard of the Iliad? It's a Greek poem. It's, have you watched the movie Troy? Troy, yeah. It's about the Trojans and the Greeks, and it's the book about that. Yeah, so that's my favorite. But I don't think it would be very helpful in the IELTS exam. And there was one more question there, I think.
Hi, my name is Oscar.
Hi.
Well, I'm very impressed with your writing score.
Thank you.
So I'd like to know what was your question? Task 2 question.
My task.
If you remember it,
yeah.
of course.
My task 2 question asked about is it between family and school, where do you think children learn more about themselves?
And I would like to know what structure you used in your body paragraphs. I mean, 2 ideas in each one or something else.
You know, I have to tell you, when I was doing my test, I wasn't really memorizing it. But I remember. So I did my first paragraph about why children are affected by school and their social circle. Then I spoke about why children are influenced by their families. And then my last sentence, my last paragraph, body paragraph, was why I think that family impact is more impactful than the school impact. So I had 5 paragraphs. Introduction, 1 point towards school, 1 point towards family, and then the third one was why I think that families are more impactful than schools, and then my 5th one was my conclusion.
Thanks, I got it.
No problem. So now we're going to play Kahoot very quickly. What are the 4 components of the IELTS exam? Can everybody see, or should we turn off the lights? Is it okay? Okay, congratulations to the top 3 people. Now we're going to move away from my personal experience doing IELTS, and we're going to move more into kind of some major mistakes that students make. And I've broken it up into 2 skills, writing and speaking, which are known as productive skills. And that's because you are producing language, right? And then there's receptive skills. So we're going to start off with writing. We're going to start off with writing. So I think 3 of the biggest mistakes that people make in task 1, and I mentioned this before, and even some of you mentioned it before, was having a weak overview, insufficient reporting of data and vocabulary, and then in writing task 2, not discussing every part of the question, which some of you have also mentioned, and not reaching the word count, which is kind of a smaller issue, but it's also something that people have. So if we can move on to the first part, which is a weak overview. I'm going to read the question, and I want you guys to start thinking about things now. So this is the graph. Can everybody see it? Great. So the prompt is, the bar charts below show the percentages of men and women in employment in 3 countries in 2005 and 2015. This is an example of an overview which I found. I'm going to read it out, and then I want you to tell me what you think is the mistake that doesn't make this a strong overview, okay? The graph demonstrates the percentage of sexes in employment in 3 different regions in 2005 and 2015. In general, both males and females had obtained more workplaces by 2005, except Swedish men. So now I want to ask you, what do you think are the issues with this overview? You can just give one answer, and someone else can say something else. Yeah.
That could be from 2005 to this period. Not only 2 years.
Okay, so you want to report the data. You want to report the dates. Okay. Any other ideas? Yeah.
The first issue, I guess, is with the introduction, because there's a lack of paraphrasing. The student just copies their employment words, the percentage of how better it is, but it's not like how much, kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really...
The second sentence is pretty cool. It's really general for the graph.
Okay, so I agree with you. I agree with you. The paraphrasing it's not helpful, because firstly it won't count towards your word count. The examiner will have to take it off, and it also shows that you're not able to kind of summarize the data without copying exactly from the question. So that was a really good point. However, you said that this part was fine, but I'm wondering, can anybody see an issue with this part of the overview? Yeah.
There are actually no the highest or lowest points, and moreover, there is no comparison or contrast points, and so I guess it's not strong overview enough.
That's exactly it. This person did like the most general overview by really not showing any comparison, not talking about the countries, not talking about the genders, what was the highest, what was the lowest, what were the differences. So that was a really good point that you mentioned. Now that you've mentioned it, I want everybody to try to write just this part of the overview. How would you make this the strongest overview that you can make it? So take 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes to write it on your phones or something, and then I will ask you what you think. Or maybe not 5 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah.
So look, in the overview it says that there were more workplaces, but I guess the data is about not the number of jobs there, but the percentage of jobs. But if the percentage is higher, it doesn't mean that there are more job places. It's just the percentage is higher.
Exactly. That's a good point.
So it's wrong, right there.
Yeah. What this person has done is kind of incorrectly analyzed the data and used synonyms that aren't necessarily accurate in this case. So now everybody take like a couple of minutes and just write 1 or 2 sentences of what you think this will be, how to make this a strong overview, and then I'll tell you some strong overviews that I found, and then how I think I can make it even stronger. Okay? So I'll give you like 2-3 minutes. Is everyone done, or do you need a little bit more time? Can anybody go first and tell us what you think, what your answer would be? If not, I'll just move on to what I found on the internet as some of the strong ones and then tell you what I think. Can we move to the next slide, please? So these are two, I think one got 7.5, one got 8. And can you see it, or do you need the lights to be turned off? Can you turn off the lights, please? Thank you so much. So these are two different, they got very high marks. I'm going to read them to you so you can see kind of how they're structured and what data they're analyzing. So 2 bar charts show the percentage of men and women in the years 2005 to 2015. We can see that there are very slight changes in the number of working men, but the number of working women, and especially in Canada, right? So that's what you mentioned. This is another one. Overall, it is clear that the employment rate of men and women increased over the period, but the exception to this was the number of men in Sweden, which declined. Sweden had the highest employment rate in 2005, which was overtaken by South Korea in 2015. So do you kind of get an idea of what is the data that they're reporting, the important data that they're reporting, and the important trends that they're reporting to include in your overview? Does this illustrate this better to you? Sorry? You didn't understand the second one? You think the second one is clearer? Okay. In fact, I would kind of edit this a little bit more to make my answer, and I would add this sentence, this one, to this one, and take out the first sentence about the years to make my overview. And the reason I would do this was because now you're talking about the men and women. You're talking about how the men did not change significantly. Women did change, especially in Canada. And then you're also talking about the fact that Sweden was the highest, but now there's another country which is the highest. So do you see now what kind of elevates an overview to make it stronger? Does it make sense? What is the data? What is the trends that I'm including to make the strongest overview? Yeah.
Or begin our overall. Instead of saying overall, we can just begin with it's clear that it's obvious that. So if we use overall, it's kind of memorization. So that's it decreases our score. What do you think about it?
I haven't heard it. I'm sure I used in general and overall as well. I'm not really sure how it's memorization because it's just a normal word like anything else. I don't think that's true. Sure, I mean, you don't have to include it, you don't have to start with overall, but I don't think that this is going to bring down your score significantly if you start with overall. You know, let's talk about this at the end because I have to move on to different parts. So that was my opinion of how to make a strong overview. Now I'm going to talk about including trends. Talk about trends in data. So I'm not going to read this for you because it's very long, but just so that you can kind of see, you can see that there aren't really any numbers that are mentioned, right? You can't see any really any years that are mentioned or any millions of tons which are mentioned in this. This is the body paragraph. I took out the overview. So as you know, if you don't report data and trends and specific very important pieces of data in task 1, you're not going to get the marks. So I'm not really going to ask you what you think. I'm not going to ask you to write it. But what are some trends, just like one trend that you can notice and mention a number that you would include? Okay, let me start. What do you think is the highest? Road, yeah. And how would you say it? How would you make a sentence that said, from this year to this year, roads went from this one to this one? How would you say it? Okay. What I'm trying to get at is that when you're writing your body paragraphs, you need to be able to identify the trends, which this one has, but you also need to identify the most important data which has been used. So you need to include things like what it started at, where did roads start at, like 70, where it went to, what was the highest, what was the lowest, what were any fluctuations, what were any plateaus. You know, those are the sorts of things that you need to include in your body paragraph. Does everybody understand that? What is your experience with task 2? What do you struggle with? Sorry, with task 1. If it's an important data point, then absolutely you should add it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it might not be the most important data that you can include, but it's an observation. You know, personally, what I would include would be the highest, the lowest. I would specifically talk about rail, that even in the span of like 30 years, it started at 40 and it ended at 40. That's an important observation that you need to make, you know? You need to make the important observation that this increased, plateaued, decreased, went back up. You know, those are the sorts of trends that you need to be talking about, and you need to talk about this specifically. Talk about specific numbers, okay? And I think some of you have mentioned about vocabulary being difficult. Obviously, in a lot of data, you have to say increase, decrease, they stayed the same. What are some synonyms that you can think of for increased? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so you guys know how to do that. Malika, can you move? These are just very, very basic examples that I showed. For increase, you can say hiked, climbed, shot up, surged, which you spoke about. And specifically for the same, I think some people maybe find it a little bit hard to say the same, which, you know, this green line is doing. But my favorite word to use is plateau, because it's a little bit of a more complex word, and it shows that you are able to use kind of a little more interesting vocabulary. Plateau? No, it's not an old-fashioned word. And as you mentioned specifically, is using these kinds of words to give your writing a little bit more flair, you know? Yeah. So now we're going to go on to speaking, which I mentioned. Oh, sorry, no, you don't have to do this. Sorry, can you go to the next part? Yeah. This is no. It's okay. So this I'm just going to mention very quickly. This is the question that was asked in writing task 2. Some people think that there should be a complete ban on all forms of advertising. To what extent do you agree or disagree? So I don't think you have time to read all of it. I'm just going to tell you what the issue is. This essay, it's an excellent essay. It has a lot of good points. The person's obviously very intelligent, wrote very well. Unfortunately, they didn't answer the question. And the question is, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Now, I'm sure you know in writing task 2, there are many different types. There's opinion, discussion, problem, advantages, disadvantages, right? Everyone knows there's different types. And so you need to learn how you can prepare your writing task 2 for every question. You can't answer the same answer for every question. You know that, right? So the problem that this person made is they spoke about the advantages and disadvantages of advertising, but only in the introduction they said, in my opinion. What I would do to fix this essay is I would maybe cut this second and third paragraph in half, and then I would talk in the third body paragraph about my opinion, right? Because it's important that the examiner knows that you're being critical, you're able to see this question from every side, but then you talk about what my opinion is, right? And so it's really unfortunate that this person had a phenomenal answer if the question was talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Okay? Now we're going to talk about speaking. And I've already pretty much spoken about everything in speaking. But as I mentioned, for me, part 2 was the most difficult. And I told you that my strategy for part 2 was pretty much timing myself and making sure that I kind of got used to the pacing of part 2. As you mentioned, there were a couple of collocations, idioms, keywords, whatever you want to call it, that I wanted to include. During the 1 minute, it's a little more calm. During the 2 minutes when you're talking, your head is all over the place. In that 1 minute, make sure that you're making really good notes about things that you want to include. And so what I would do for my part 2 was there are 3 bullet points. The advice that I got from the YouTube videos was talk about every single bullet point. And so what I would do was next to every bullet point, I would write my answer, and then in brackets, I would write like a little story, like a personal story or a world story, so that I could kind of fluff up my 2 minutes so that I reached the word count, the time limit. And in task 1, I think a problem that a lot of people have is they don't talk enough during a question. A lot of times the IELTS examiner will ask you a yes or no question. For example, do you like road trips, right? That's a yes or no question. But you're not supposed to give a yes or no answer. So you're supposed to give a little bit of elaboration. So you can say, yes, I really do enjoy road trips. However, in my personal experience, the past couple of road trips I've had, I've started to feel sick when I'm on the road for too long. So therefore, in practice, I don't like the concept of road trips, but in theory, I think road trips are a great way to spend time with your friends or your family. That's an example of a good, buffed out answer to a question. So you're demonstrating to the IELTS examiner, I can talk about several different topics at length. Try never to talk less than they're expecting. It's okay if you talk and they tell you, let's move on to the next question. But don't ever fizzle out of what you're trying to say, okay? So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. Now I'm going to open up the floor again to any questions that people have, specifically about any strategies for writing and speaking. Yeah.
Is it true that in English saying yes is better than saying no and giving proofs?
No, I don't think so. From the YouTube videos that I've watched, examiners don't care about your opinion. They just want to see if you can elaborate on your opinion and if you can back it up. So I don't think it matters if you say yes or no, as long as you have something to support your answer.
It's about structuring your opinion, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I already had like 7 inventory exams in writing. And for example, you just mentioned the question to what extent you agree or disagree with. And in such questions, I just, let's say, supported one side, like the side I supported, and I didn't really discuss the other sides. Do you think that was the problem to my score? Because I really wanted to get something like 7 plus, in writing.
I don't think it was probably the fact that you only stuck to one. When I went into my writing exam, I made sure that I covered both points before I gave my opinion. Even if it was just 2 or 3 lines about this perspective, 2 or 3 lines about this perspective, and then maybe 5 or 6 lines about my opinion, I tried to be critical. So I tried to show that I'm seeing this question from every side. Some questions will require no personal opinion and only advantages and disadvantages. So in that sense, it's about recalibrating your answer to fit the question. However, my advice would be, regardless of what, okay, not regardless, but in a lot of questions, it's helpful to add both perspectives.
How about, for example, the question says discuss both sides, but you don't really give your opinion? What if you give your opinion?
In that sense, I would think you're taking away from your word count. If you include your opinion and you're adding extra words that you don't need, you can use those words more efficiently by supporting the agree and disagree. So I think in that sense, it's not about marking you. You yourself are letting yourself be held back by a good score because you're adding unnecessary information. Any other question? Yeah?
Which is better, giving counter argument or giving
It depends on the question. It really depends on the question. You know, I wish I could say, like, this is the golden rule, but it really depends on what you're being asked, you know?
Trying to spin around or provide some mess. What can you recommend? How can I use my time wisely and limit myself, but at the same time do it efficiently?
Okay, you're talking about the part 2 when you have talked for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. So when you do your exam, you get a piece of paper that has bullet points, right? So when I started that, I would try to answer all the bullet points, and I would make sure that in the 2 minutes, I'm first talking about all of those before I go on and talk about other stories. So when you talk in your 2 minutes, do you use your bullet points as a structure or a guide?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is I can talk like for ages, and always I'm being stopped by my examiner in the mock speaking test. And the problem is I want to use this time efficiently, trying to express myself fully, provide some like complex, advanced words, and I don't use it. I just try to spin around the topic, provide some mess. That's a problem. But I want to be extremely efficient. That's the point.
How do you practice for it?
Yeah, whenever I'm alone, I just use my mirror, timing, like under exam conditions, absolutely. But whenever I have some classes with my friends or colleagues, I work with them.
So do you time yourself? As I mentioned, I time myself with 2 minutes and I see the time. Do you do that?
Actually, I use my watch.
Yeah, so you kind of have like the opposite problem that most students have, which is you talk a lot. The one thing I can say is, you know, for me, I also had the struggle where sometimes I would talk too little, sometimes I would talk too much. And what helped me most was just doing lots of practices every single day and seeing where my weakness is. So if I have 3 prompts and I see that I'm talking too much about this specific thing and I don't have enough time to talk about the last bullet points, that's something that you need to be aware of, right? So the next time you say, okay, I'm going to maybe not include this unnecessary story. Maybe I'm not going to talk about 2 examples or 3 examples for this bullet point. I'll just talk about 1. You know what I mean? So about if you know that this is an issue for you, then through practice of like stopping yourself from talking unnecessarily, eventually you'll kind of understand how much 2 minutes of talking is. But I mean, just for reference, in my exam, I was also stopped. Yeah.
So we are about to finalize. Only one last question.
Can I ask a question?
No.
No?
Ask one last question, maybe from the audience, which is from far behind. Do you have questions? One last question. That's it. Problem if you have kind of tough question in the part 3 exam, speaking exam especially, how can we get rid of, how can we handle this situation if we have very tough question even we cannot answer this in our native language, let's say.
Oh, I see. So if the question is so hard that you don't know the answer, you know, that's a situation. I guess it's really bad luck. But I think mostly, especially when you come to, for example, an English school, we try to practice basically a huge, broad, all the options that you can be asked in IELTS, and we try to focus on what are the current events that are happening, what do you think about them, and so hopefully through like strong preparation, strong and relevant preparation, you'll be able to answer almost every question.
The students, among the other Uzbek students, let's say we have problem about the ideas, global ideas, and another question is there any true or false answer in the speaking test?
No, there's no true or false answer because the IELTS exam is not checking how smart you are. They're only trying to see how you can convey your thoughts. So whether you have a completely wrong idea and the examiner thinks that you're completely wrong, they can't judge you on it. They can only judge how well you support that. And if you speak eloquently, if you speak cohesively and you give good examples, then the examiner cannot focus on your opinion, just about your English speaking.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms.Aania.
Thank you so much.